Yes, I've started the recording by the cloud.
Okay, there. So we already have Bianca recording the Mongolian channel. So Bianca just needs to be in the Mongolian channel when the Mongolian translator starts the interpretation, and then we have the cloud recording here in the main floor. Okay, maybe you could just do a very, very quick photo of all the speakers. May I just request all speakers to turn on their cameras, but just noting that we already have Mr.
Should I
Pavit.
put down the welcome slide?
No, it's okay. Do you already have Mr. Pavit here?
I think he's not yet in Zoom.
There.
Yes, I'm on the call.
I see Pavit.
Okay, I see him now.
Okay. There. I'll just take the photo. Lakshmi, I think we lost you. Sorry. There. Okay. I'll just turn off my photo there. Just a quick one. 1, 2, 3. Okay, just one again. Just making sure we all got that. 1, 2, 3. There. Okay. We could start admitting and open the floor and start the event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I think we should open. We are already open, right? It's almost 3.
Yeah.
Can
Yes,
we let people in?
Yes, we are already letting people in.
Good afternoon. I think we will begin. It's 3 o'clock sharp. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Emma Fan. I'm the Director of Public Sector Management, Financial Sector, Regional Cooperation Division in the East Asia Department of ADB. So we're delighted to have the event with you today. Before we formally start, I just want to mention a few house rules. The first one is that if you're not speaking, please keep the mic mute all the time. If you want to raise questions or make a comment, please use the chat box or raise your hand. And if you need to use the translation function, you will be able to see it on the bottom part of your Zoom. You can choose between English or Mongolia. And finally, we will also circulate the workshop materials after the event. So today's event is the second in the EAPF, EARD, and Governance TG SDCC Joint Knowledge Series entitled Fiscal Management, Local Governance, and Economic Growth in a Post-COVID World. It follows from our successful organization of the event on the PRC entitled The Role of Local Governments in Promoting High Quality Growth, which was held on the 1st of July. So today we are traveling to Mongolia, and we will cover a very relevant topic on decentralization, local governance, and local economic development in the country. To all participants from ADB and outside, a warm welcome. We have a very exciting agenda. We're delighted that DG Bruno Carrasco from SDCC will make the opening remarks. Following that, we will hear presentations by Hans Van Rijn, Principal Public Management Specialist from our division, EAPF, and Roger Shorten, Managing Director of Local Development Associates based in Bangkok. And then we have 2 distinguished panelists Lakshmi from the Economic Policy and Competitiveness Research Center based in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, and Zozaya from the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. Finally, our colleagues and country director in the Mongolia resident mission, Pavit, will give the closing remarks. So I will provide more introduction to our speakers as we go along. To begin, I would like to call DG Bruno from our SDCC to give the opening remarks. Over to you, Bruno. I think, Bruno, you are muted.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So good afternoon to everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on decentralization, local governance, and local economic development in Mongolia. Before providing some reflections and context to this important topic of today's webinar, I'd like first to wish our colleagues from Mongolia a belated happy Nadam. On a more personal note, I worked on Mongolia and with Mongol Bank in the early years of my career at ADB in the late 1990s, and I have very fond memories of the people and the country. Shifting to today's event, this webinar is the second, as Emma has said, in a series of 5 events focusing on the general theme of fiscal management, local governance, and economic growth in the post-COVID-19 world. All of these events are jointly hosted by the Public Management, Financial Sector, and Regional Integration and Cooperation Division of the East Asia Department, led by Emma, and the Secretariat of ADB's Governance Thematic Group in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, which I represent. We are truly appreciative of this work. Today's presentation is part of the wider context of the role of local governments in providing public services and in enabling local economic development. Strengthening subnational governments by and large is recognized as part of ADB's long-term strategy 2030 agenda, as well as our operational priority 6 on strengthening governance and institutional capacity. Strengthening subnational government is also key to deliver on the sustainable development goals, and recognizing also that a large share of the SDG targets involve local governments. In this respect, I would like to briefly touch today on 3 issues in my remarks. The first is on the ongoing debate on the pros and cons of decentralization. The second is on the practice of decentralization in the region itself. And finally, the extent to which local governments in our Asia-Pacific region are well positioned to deliver on the SDGs. Turning to the first point then, the ongoing debate. Decentralization and strengthening local governments have been a constant feature in the Asia-Pacific region for 3 decades now, approximately. Much has been discussed on what constitutes good decentralization reforms and what are some of the realistic and empirical benefits of decentralization. Proponents of decentralization typically highlight the importance of the subsidiarity principle. Local governments are, of course, closer to the ground realities of the local communities and can, of course, better reflect spending priorities. This, of course, hinges on opportunities for popular participation and voice in decision-making. With the prospects of regular local elections, it also provides for greater accountability by mayors and councillors as they expand and improve the provision of public services for that community. Critics of decentralization, on the other hand, often point to the costs of developing effective multi-tiered governments. The fiscal as well as economic viability of highly decentralized systems of governance, and even the risk of resource capture by the local elites. The key point is, in my view, the importance of recognizing the realities in the country and in the subnational jurisdictions. And 1, adopting a differentiated approach that can be tailored to meet the local requirements. And then 2, recognizing that Rome was not built overnight, and gradually and progressively investing in strengthening absorptive capacity will with built-in checks and balances should ensure a stable and strong process of improved decentralization and higher quality service delivery. Moreover, when it is designed and implemented well, it does offer distinct advantages for the achievement of development objectives, including the SDGs. Now, if we turn to the practice, the experience with decentralization reforms around the world has revealed a range of lessons for the successful design and implementation of those reforms, including efforts to strengthen the role of local governments. Some of these include, first, the need for political buy-in from central ministries and the need for an apex political body that can guide the decentralization of reforms. Two, a clearly defined vision of roles and responsibilities across the different tiers of government, as well as clear functional assignments that avoid duplication. Third, fiscal, public financial management, and human resource arrangements that support the division of roles and responsibilities. Fourth, well-designed capacity development initiatives, and this is a very important point, for local governments. We need to ensure that there is strong absorptive capacity. Finally, the fifth one is robust performance monitoring and accountability systems. Now, in reality, it is not common for all of these 5 preconditions to be in place. And in many countries in our region, decentralization still represents what we refer to as a work in progress. The extent to which local governments can live up to their promise differs from place to place. Local government performance in providing public services and facilitating local economic development seems to be influenced largely by 2 main factors. One is the structural constraints, on their operations. And 2, going back to the point I mentioned earlier, capacity constraints at the local level. If we drill a little bit deeper on these 2, we can see that common structural constraints may include such things as conflicting laws and regulations. It can include gaps between the responsibilities assigned to local governments and the own financial resources or own resources that they have at their disposal to deliver on those assigned mandates. And this is what we typically refer to as the vertical imbalances. There's also a consideration on the wide varying absorptive capacity across local governments within a national jurisdiction. And here we tend to refer to some of the aspects related to horizontal imbalances. And then the resulting multi-tiered level of decentralization, as well as the weaknesses in policy and administrative coordination. Now, if we look at the second item on capacity constraints, capacity is often, we find, a more binding constraint to decentralization in terms of both the limited number of civil servants employed at the local level, and of course, weaknesses in the technical proficiency of those staff. So for us, capacity development is something that we take very seriously. There is mostly through our technical assistance, a lot of efforts to raise that capacity, especially focusing at the local level. Now, what does this all mean for the Strategy 2030 agenda and for our countries? So here, I think it should be clear that the unique circumstances under which local governments operate greatly influences their ability to provide quality public services and their ability to promote local economic development. As a result, it also greatly impacts on their ability to support the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. With this general context in mind, it will be very interesting to learn more about the state of Mongolia's system of decentralized governance, progress made over the years, and how Mongolia's system of decentralized governance compares with other systems. Today's presentation is based on a forthcoming technical paper co-authored by our 2 distinguished presenters, Roger Schotten and Hans van Ryn. The preparation of the paper, of course, was supported through a regional technical assistance initiative. We also very much look forward to the findings of this paper in the presentations. We have, in addition to the two presenters, two distinguished discussants today with us, Zolzaya and Lakshmi. And again, forgive me as I will not dare to pronounce your last names. Let me therefore now conclude by thanking Emma and her division for organizing the event, as well as that of Pavit and the Mongolia Resident Mission. We want to again indicate and express our deep appreciation for all of this work in organizing these events, and we do hope that it meets your expectation. I very much look forward to a successful event today. Thank you very much. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you very much, Bruno. I think for your very insightful remarks. You have highlighted the conceptual pros and the cons, the trade-offs in decentralization. You have also outlined practical lessons and experience in general. As you have mentioned, the decentralization is a very unique journey that each country needs to travel, and it's promoted by many factors as well as constrained by many other factors. And Mongolia clearly provides a very enlightening example for us to explore such issues in practice, and the discussion will contribute to our achievements of Strategy 2030 objectives. So with that, we will now move to the next stage of this event, which is about the presentation by Hans and Roger. Just some brief introduction of our presenters. Roger is the Managing Director, Local Development Associates based in Bangkok. Over the past 30 years, he has worked extensively with many international agencies, such as ADB, the World Bank, UNDP, and UNICEF across Asia and Africa. His work focuses on subnational government issues, such as fiscal transfer mechanisms, local government financing, and budgeting and planning arrangements. So Roger, thank you for being with us today. Hans is the Principal Public Management Specialist in EAPF, East Asia Department of ADB. He has been working with ADB for over 14 years now. In EARD, Hans' work mainly covers public finance related topics, such as financing of local governments, intergovernmental relationships, local government debt management, and sovereign wealth management. So the floor is yours, Roger and Hans.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you very much, Bruno, for your kind opening remarks. In our presentation, we will actually follow a little bit the structure of Bruno's opening remarks. I can't seem to switch slides now. What could be the problem? Could somebody help with this?
Hans, maybe you could try to stop share and reshare again. There.
And reshare again? Okay, here we go. Does it show?
In the
Yes, so we can see it. Yeah.
You can see it, yeah? Okay.
Maybe you can put on slideshow if that works. If it doesn't work, this will also be fine.
Let me see what I can do. Like this? All right, yeah, here we are. Okay, sorry about that, but now everything seems to work. So like I said, our presentation will roughly follow the structure of Bruno's opening remarks. I will start, the presentation has sort of 4 parts. I will start with providing a little bit of context in terms of Mongolia's macroeconomics and the overall structure of its public administration. Then I will follow that with an overview of the formal features of Mongolia's decentralized system of governance. After that, I will hand over to Roger, and Roger will focus on how these formal features of that system actually translate in practice. And we will do that by looking at 2 issues, particularly local public spending or service delivery by local governments, and the use that they make of their regulatory and convening powers. I will then bring the presentation to an end with some conclusions on the existing challenges, but also the existing opportunities in Mongolia. Now, in terms of the macroeconomic context, my assumption is that everybody here on the call is aware that for Mongolia, of course, a key feature macroeconomically is the volatility that is caused by the high dependence on mining revenues and therefore the exposure to the whims of international commodity markets. And you can see in figure 1 clearly how that volatility manifests itself over the last, say, 10, 12 years. Because of the macroeconomic volatility, of course, there's also a high fiscal volatility, which we show in the graph on the right side of the screen. Now, a common sort of mitigation measure that is recommended to mitigate the effects of that volatility is to diversify the economy. And with diversification, we not only refer to expanding the number of sectors of economic activity, but also diversifying spatially. Right now, there's a huge concentration of economic activity in and around Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia. And there is a need also to look at more regional or local based economic development. And in that, to motivate and to enable local economic development, of course, local governments in principle have an important role to play. Now, before I move to Mongolia itself, maybe not everybody on the call is sort of well versed in public finance and public administration lingo. So let me just spend maybe 1 minute on some small conceptual notes. Typically, 3 forms of decentralization are distinguished. The first form is deconcentration, and that basically refers to the local level presence of central ministries. So these are just satellite offices of central ministries that do not belong to the proper local government system. A second type of decentralization is referred to as delegation, and that refers to the delegation of very specific managerial and administrative responsibilities by a central ministry to a local government. Now, the most extreme form of decentralization, if you like, is referred to as devolution, and that really refers to a proper transfer of decision-making power and fiscal authority for public sector functions from the central government to lower levels of government. Now, in reality, of course, and we will see that that also applies to Mongolia, in any country that is decentralized, these 3 types of decentralization coexist. And that also represents occasional challenges. Now, if we look at Mongolia, the basic legal foundation for the local government system is the Law on Administrative and Territorial Units and Their Governance, or LATUK, which most recently was revised in 2020. Institutionally, it's a dual system of subnational governments with a legislative branch and an executive branch. Oversight is split up or fragmented, if you like, between a number of central agencies that are listed on the bottom left of the slide. We'll come back to that issue later. And on the right side of the slide, you see some basic numbers around the local government system in Mongolia, which I'm not going to repeat. In a diagrammatic form, this is how the system of decentralized governance in Mongolia looks. On the left side of the slide, we see the legislative arm. On the right side of the slide, we see the executive arm. And we also see here what I referred to earlier, a mix of deconcentration and proper devolution. In the center, you see the local government, the elected local governments proper. And on the right side, you see that these are sort of mirrored by the presence of local offices of central ministries and agencies. And that, as Roger will also share with us later, causes a number of challenges in terms of coordination and financing. Now, in summary, what are sort of the broad challenges in the legal and institutional framework? First of all, there's not a single apex political body that guides the pace and direction of decentralization reform. So the oversight of that reform process is split up between a number of agencies, including the Cabinet Secretariat and the Ministry of Finance. Related to that, there is also not a single body, like for example, a Ministry of Local Government in many countries, that acts as a secretariat to that high-level political body. So again, here also on the administrative side, responsibility for oversight and guidance is fragmented. As a result, there is no strong across-government drive towards major decentralization. If you look at the legal and regulatory framework, apart from the LATUC, which is basically the local government code, and the budget law, there is quite a strong issue of a lack of legal harmonization. There's a lot of conflicts between LATUC and various sector laws. As a result of that, there are issues around local coordination and issues around dual subordination or dual accountability lines. There are discrepancies in terms of the status and power of urban authorities and the role of mayors. Then there's an equity issue, which again, Roger will go into in more detail at the sub-IMAC level. IMAC is the provincial level in Mongolia. SUMs are sub-provincial local governments, and IMACs enjoy a wide discretion in regard to the SUMs in their respective provinces, which leads to all sorts of equity issues. And then there are a series of major constraints and rigidities in the intergovernmental fiscal framework and in public financial management arrangements that impact obviously on service delivery and which result in a very limited local autonomy for local governments. So far, an overview of the formal features. I'll now hand it over to Roger to look at how this pans out in practice. Roger.
Thank you, Hans, and good afternoon, everybody. So now we want to look at the role of local governments in local development and the SDG agenda generally, and in addressing the types of diversification challenges that Hans just outlined in the earlier part of his presentation, looking both at the potential role, but then the real constraints which limit that role of local governments. And in doing so, we're going to separate the role in two parts. The spending role of local governments, which is where we're going to start here now, and then the role deriving from local governments' regulatory and convening powers, if you like, the non-spending activities of local governments. So starting here on the spending role, just a few metrics on this slide. Local budget in Mongolia represents about 28% of all government spending, which if you plot that on the chart in the top right-hand corner with other OECD countries, there's a red star, hopefully you can see there, which shows where Mongolia would be found there. Obviously, not at all the most decentralized country. I mean, nothing like Canada, way up on the top right. And of course, nothing like China either, which is even more decentralized. Somewhere around about the level of Italy, and actually rather more decentralized than my own country, Great Britain or France for that matter. So a reasonable, somewhere in the middle of the decentralization spectrum. Though, as we'll come back to discuss, that is somewhat misleading because that share of spending on the local budgets, actually, there's little local discretion allowed to local governments over that spending, as we'll see shortly. A few other metrics, most of the spending is recurrent budget. There's not much capital budget. Between Ulaanbaatar and the IMAGs represents most of the spending, but Ulaanbaatar, not surprisingly, represents most of the local revenues, given that that's where most economic activity is located. Lastly, just a reminder in that little table there of the paradigm, the budget surplus deficit paradigm, which prevails still in Mongolia and in a number of other former socialist managed economies, where we have UB and 5 IMAGs, which are currently in surplus, which means they have to give up part of their surplus revenues to central government, which then gets redistributed in the bigger pot. The numbers of sums which are in surplus or deficit is really not well known, I'm afraid. And this actually represents a rather bigger problem of access to budget data in Mongolia if you don't have easy connections with the Ministry of Finance. Over slide, please, Hans. So here, since we always start discussions on local spending with a look at the functions or the expenditure responsibilities of local governments, the budget law distinguishes two types of responsibility. The base expenditure functions, which is the top row, which in a sense are kind of devolved functions over which local authorities are supposed to have a fair amount of discretion. As we will see, they don't have that much, but we'll come to that later. So we see a range of things from, of course, local administration to local roads and street lighting and so forth and so on, including environmental protection, water supply, waste removal, some of the classic sorts of functions which are decentralized to local governments in most countries. The bottom part of that shows the delegated functions, which are those functions, particularly in the social services, education, health, etc., which are delegated on the basis of central government agreements with each IMAG. There are annual performance agreements established, and each IMAG has to sign up to things it will do in each agreement. And then each IMAG signs up corresponding agreements with its SUMs in those same sectors. So overall, by regional standards, international standards, a fairly modest set of functions which are dominated by the delegated functions over which local government has limited formal discretion. Over page, please. So how are these functions financed? This is a quick summary of the financing sources. Own revenues, on average, account for 18% of the funding of all of those expenditures. Own revenues dominated by personal income tax, as the top right-hand pie chart shows. There are other things there as well, which are important in certain IMAGs. For example, taxes on natural resource and extractive activities. But overall, that's the picture on the top right. Fiscal transfers overall dominate, not surprisingly, as they do in most countries in Asia, with over 80% on average of all revenues. Though there are three types of fiscal transfer. The deficit transfers, which are allocated to those deficit local governments. And again, a typical feature of many former socialist countries, and some often called negotiated gap filling transfers in the finance literature. Then we have the most important one, which is the special purpose transfers, which finance the delegated social service spending. And that's the big orange slice in the bottom right-hand pie. And then we have the local development fund transfers, which are relatively modest. You'll see only 4%, which finance capital spending. All the other transfers, by the way, are really only for recurrent spending. And the local development fund transfer we'll come to later on as a rather interesting innovation, which was brought in the 2012 budget law. Borrowing, theoretically, of course, is always there, but in practice it's not. Ulaanbaatar was given borrowing powers, but these were repealed in 2015 after concerns about the overall national debt ceiling which had been reached. Next page, please. So we talked so far about averages. This is just a little sense of the variance within those averages, since averages, as we know, can be misleading. So on the left side, the two pie charts capture revenue breakdowns of Ulaanbaatar at the top, which of course is dominated, not surprisingly, by the blue own source revenues, with transfers being much more modest, contrasted to the IMAGs at the bottom, which are hugely dependent on transfers, and particularly the special purpose transfers. The right-hand bar chart computes these revenues on a per capita basis for each IMAG, and again shows some interesting variance both in composition by IMAG, and we see that there are also not just UB but also Umnogovi and Govi Sumber at the bottom, have, or rather Umnogovi particularly, has very substantial own source revenues, the blue part, due to it sitting on those mining extractive activities. We also see quite an interesting range in per capita total spending capacity. I mean, the difference between Govi Sumber at the bottom and Govi Altai at the top is about 7-to-1 per capita. So it does raise some questions about the equity implications of these very differing levels of spending capacity, which we maybe want to come back to. Over page, please, Hans. My apologies for rushing a bit here because there's a lot to go through. This here takes us to a sample budget for one particular SUM, the lower level local government, in one IMAG for 2017. This sort of budget data is actually very hard to get hold of, as I said earlier. So we put this together. On the left, we have the spending breakdown. On the right, we have the revenue breakdown for that SUM. And the color coding is an attempt to try and match up the way that the different sorts of revenues, the three main revenues on the right, namely the special purpose transfers, the deficit transfers, and local revenues, and the LDF transfers, the way they are tied into specific types of spending on the left-hand side. So all the social spending on health centers and schools is all funded from, in the orange block on the left, is all funded from the orange block on the right, from the special purpose transfers, and from nothing else. The administrative expenditures on the left, the governor's offices, the rural facilities, etc., in green, are all and only funded from local revenues and deficit transfers on the right. And the modest 19% of local investments on the left in gray are, of course, funded and only funded from the LDF transfer on the right. So that itself is already a preview of some of the straitjacketing or the earmarking that local governments face in making their spending choices. Over, please, Hans. So this is just a summary. So that's a preview of the constraints. More generally, local governments do face, even though they have this nominal 28% of the total government budget is at local level, they face a huge number of constraints in their ability to tailor and adapt and respond to local requests and local needs in the annual budgeting process for different sorts of reasons. Firstly, the delegated functions, those social service, delegated social services funded from those transfers, the specific transfers, are highly straitjacketed through a series of ministerial budget guidelines, which dictate how much money is allowed to be spent on supplies per student, what the heating costs per square meter of facility are, and so forth and so on. And where local governments in their budget deviate from that, they tend to get cut back and changed at central level. The devolved base, the base budget spending on local administration funded from own revenues and the deficit transfers is similarly subject to a range of different budget norms applied by CABSEC, Cabinet Secretariat, and by Ministry of Finance. Again, straitjacketing the local budgeting decisions. Lastly, there is, apart from the local development fund, there is no real capital budget at local level. All the capital spending on things like schools, hospitals, roads is all decided on a central ministry budget, a central level. And there, local governments can only propose upwards. And to give you an idea of what that means, we talked to people in one IMAG, Govisumba, who for 2019 had put together a package of investment proposals for some 30 billion tugrug. At the end of the process, 2 billion were approved. They were never consulted at all why the things were approved, why what was approved and why the other things were not. There was no consultation in that. And a general sense of frustration, and had we been consulted, we would have chosen other things out of that package sort of feeling. And also a feeling that a lot of those central decisions are subject to a great deal of political interference in UB. Aside from that, the budget process, the lack of clear advanced budget ceilings given to local authorities in the budget process encourages wish lists and lack of real local prioritization, and also discourages local consultation, since there's a feeling that so much is anyway predetermined. Why bother to consult? and indeed the local elected horals themselves, their own role in review and approval of the budget, the local budget, is extremely limited and often in many cases little more than a rubber stamp, rather undermining their own credibility in local governance. A last point here is that the way that these fiscal transfers, the deficit transfers and the special purpose transfers, which dominate local financing, the way they work, they are computed on the basis of summing up lots of very specific types of funding component of those different transfers on an IMAG by IMAG basis, such that the total outcome is very hard for central government to ensure horizontal equity in the overall funding patterns by IMAG, which emerge from that, which I think is probably quite a challenge for looking ahead. And as Hans noted earlier, the IMAGs themselves are allowed a lot of relatively unchecked discretion in their onward allocation of budgets to their SUMs. They get little guidance as to how to do that, and the anecdotal evidence that we have seen suggests a lot of discrepancy and disparity in that process. Over, Hans? One more interesting element in that funding architecture is the Local Development Fund, which was an important innovation in the budget law in 2012. I won't go into the details of how it works. It's a little bit complicated, but why is it important? Firstly, it's really the only capital budget resource for local governments. Secondly, it's the only resource of which there is genuine local discretion allowed. The budget, the project choices do not have to go up for sign off or approval at central level. It's really left to the IMAGs and the SUMs to make their choices within the guidelines that they are given. There is mandatory local participation, citizen voting in the planning process, which is actually complied with quite faithfully, quite strictly, almost too strictly at times, I would say. Ministry of Finance is embarking on some interesting performance-based arrangements around that fund, which we can talk about. I've been involved in myself. And overall, the formula-based allocation, which governs a part of the Local Development Fund, is perhaps a potential more widely across the rest of the fiscal transfer system if we are interested in moving towards greater overall equity in geographic spending. There are a few policy issues around the fund, but I don't think we've got time to go into those now. We can come back to them if we want. A lot has to do with the volatility and unpredictability of the transfers to date, and to some of the equity concerns arising from that part of the mechanism which is associated with revenue sharing by derivation, by origin, on the mining revenues, which of course benefit some areas, but not other areas not at all, which actually causes a lot of disparity. But we can maybe come back to that. The next chart illustrates these, but I don't think we have time. Hans, if we can just perhaps skip the next slide, which illustrates the points I've just been making, but we can come back if people are interested. So now on to the second part of the role of local governments, the part associated with their regulatory and convening powers. These powers derive from those written into the Latug law, which has just been revised, that Hans mentioned, but also a whole range of other sector laws, the mineral law, the environment law, and so on and so forth. Now, we picked up, just to illustrate, on the left, 4 areas of local development where these sorts of powers are potentially very important. First one is the COVID response. The second, the urbanization, managing the urbanization challenge. The third, promoting local economic development and diversification. And the fourth, environmental protection. We could think of others, of course, but these are just 4 quite important areas of local development, which are not always about local spending. On the right is a reminder of some of those powers in terms of issuance of permits, zoning, provision of incentives, some convening powers, etc., which local governments have been granted in these different laws. And so let's look quickly at some of these 4 areas and look at some of the issues coming. The COVID response, not surprisingly, the main government response in terms of health delivery, social protection is very much a central government responsibility. So not a lot for local government to be doing in Mongolia there. However, there are areas where the governors, for example, have played a really important role in messaging, in promoting social awareness, in mobilizing private sector and civil society support for responses to the COVID outbreak, in monitoring, and in deciding upon locally tailored types of restrictions on movement or on market closures and so forth, which it was realized would need to be done on a very area-specific basis, given the huge variety in conditions across such a large country as Mongolia. So that's a hint of some of the roles that governments have been playing and will continue to play, no doubt, and for COVID. The next slide, please, Hans. So urbanization challenge, no need to remind you all the huge population movements there have been from the countryside into UB and into the secondary urban centers. The graph shows that. I guess one major challenge is that so far the main law, Latug, has had an undifferentiated approach to local institutional arrangements. And so the urban authorities have not been given so far any particular powers or responsibilities to deal with those very specific challenges faced in urban areas, to do with congestion, zoning, and so forth and so on. And indeed, the zoning laws themselves under separate legislation and the laws on land ownership and use are quite rigid and have proved a problem for local authorities in actually doing what they should be trying to do. A last sort of problem faced in delivering services, particularly the peri-urban settlements, which are the ones which are getting crowded in this urbanization process in the GUR areas, is that many of the service agencies are, there are a lot of them. There's a multiple set of public agencies set up years ago, operate in a rather rigid fashion with quite heavy overhead costs. And it's very difficult to, within that framework, to improve and make service delivery more flexible to these emerging needs in the urbanization process. Next slide, please, Hans. So the local economic development challenge, again, legislation gives all sorts of powers in a fairly general way to local authorities. And I won't go into details, but there's often very little guidance as to how to use these generic powers in a strategic way. And indeed, the capital investment constraint that I mentioned earlier means that local authorities in urban areas simply are not able to make their own decisions to invest in the sort of economic infrastructure that would be needed to encourage private sector development in the urban setting. There's some interesting annual survey conducted by Lakshmi's Institute, and she may talk to this in a moment, shows some quite a considerable variance between the 21 IMAGs and UB itself in regard to the climate for local business development. And the two charts at the bottom are just illustrating two criteria, two indices. The left, we have some variation in perceptions of local tendering transparencies, and on the right, perceptions of the quality of the local administrative regulatory framework for business development. And you see quite some variance, but which of course also suggests that there's scope for leveling up, for improving the performance of the worst performers in these sorts of areas, maybe without too much difficulty, perhaps. Lakshmi will talk to that, I hope, in a moment. Lastly, over page, environmental conservation, particularly thinking here of the impact of the mining sector, which of course is so massively important in the national economy, but poses such challenges for the environment. Now here, local governments have been given a substantial number of powers under the mineral law, the environmental law, and so forth, to issue land and water permits only where operators perform well, to ensure that operators adopt environmental management plans, to negotiate and implement different sorts of local level agreements between operators, communities, and local government, and to administer the reclamation funds which operators are supposed to pay into. The reality is, however, that most of these provisions are not implemented, not abided by. And one suspects, again, that very much because the regulatory framework to back up these rather generic legal provisions has not been clearly developed or developed in a binding way. And there's just not much guidance being given so far to governors to local authorities as to how to implement them, how to decide, for example, if an operator has or has not been operating satisfactorily, and therefore whether or not to renew the permit, and general lack of guidance and training and awareness. So look, that's a quick rushed overview of some of the potential roles of local government and the constraints faced by them in addressing local development challenges and ultimately in localizing the SDG agenda. Over to you, Hans.
Thank you very much, Roger. Let me now try to quickly sort of bring this home by summarizing a number of the challenges, but certainly also a number of the opportunities that came out of the previous slide. If we start with the challenges, I think overall at the moment, for a number of legal, fiscal, and institutional reasons, the ability for local governments to provide services in a responsive way and to leverage their regulatory and convening powers is compromised by a number of constraints. Of course, there's the issue of weak local capacity, but in addition to that, there are the sort of structural constraints that are listed on the slide. As a result, accountability, effectiveness and efficiency and the equity of local government spending is compromised, and the role that they potentially could play is also undermined. So when these challenges are left unaddressed, it will also undermine, obviously, the potential of local governments in Mongolia to contribute to the achievement of the SDG agenda. But it's obviously not all bad news. There are also quite a lot of opportunities that can be built on. Where there's no push for major decentralization, like we've seen, for example, in Indonesia, sort of a big bang approach to decentralization reform. We don't see that in, which comes with its own problems, by the way. In Mongolia, we see a more incremental progress towards greater decentralization. The 2012 budget law certainly swung the needle from centralization to a modest form of decentralization. There are a number of revised laws, including major revisions to the LATUK and major revisions to the budget law, that provide openings towards more decentralization. There is a planned major increase of a fourfold increase in LDF funding, for example, that would obviously make a big difference. There is an increasing sign of recognition in sector ministries that greater decentralization in budget decision making and fiscal autonomy for local governments makes sense to allow for more local flexibility in decision making. There are a number of legal openings which can be better leveraged through improved operational guidance. These operate around urban development, local economic development, the environment. There are also opportunities for greater participation and engagement with civil society, which can be leveraged. And there's a growing number of local and national civil society organizations that focus on governance and on the operations of local government. So on the whole, I think the picture is mixed, like in a lot of countries. There are certain rigidities in the system that need to be addressed, that's for sure. There are certainly also capacity issues at the local level, but there are also, like I just ended the presentation, a series of opportunities to address current constraints in the decentralized system of governance. And with that, we've come to the end of the presentation, and I'll hand it back to Emma.
Thank you very much, Hans and Roger. That's a very rich and excellent presentation, which is very well structured. You touched upon so many dimensions of local governance, the adequacy, equity, rigidities, accountability, and so forth. Clearly, there are many challenges to localize the SDGs and to deliver services at the local level. Yet at the same time, many positive steps have also been taken. So now let's learn the insights from colleagues and experts who live in Mongolia, work in Mongolia, who are on the ground. So I'll now turn to our first panelist, Zaya. I'm also not going to attempt to pronounce your family name. So Zaya is a senior national program officer at the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, or SDC, in Mongolia. SDC is an important bilateral partner with Mongolia, especially in the area of decentralization. Having worked with the SDC for over 15 years, Zaya brings with her in-depth understanding and knowledge on decentralization and local governance in Mongolia. So over to you. The floor is yours, Zaya.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in this interesting and important discussion on the role of subnational governments and the way to strengthen them. I really appreciate the quality of the analytical paper shared with us prior to the discussion, both in terms of the scope and in the depth of the analysis. The analysis of the constraints done in a very comprehensive way and considers the allocation of both functions and finances, as well as the administrative competencies of different state levels, and also to the extent possible for this assignment. We know that the assignment has been done more than a year ago, so it's been really interesting to read. I'm also confident that the policymakers, researchers, and the practitioners like us would find it very useful to stimulate reflections on possible strategies and approaches for the support of the implementation of decentralization reform, which is ongoing in Mongolia. Extensively, our presenters were covering the structural constraints and opportunities based on the analysis, and I cannot agree more. We know that there is the very serious lack of clear delineation of responsibilities between different government levels. We also can see the local low financial autonomy of the subnational authorities due to high deficiency on grants and a low share of own revenues. High discrepancies among the jurisdictions with respect both fiscal capacities and fiscal needs, and revenue assignments that are not fully assigned with functions. Further problems, of course, we can see in relation to separation of power between the executive and legislative bodies. As Hans mentioned, the dual subordination of executive bodies at subnational level, and of course, unclarity or the need to clarify legal status of urban jurisdiction and the capital city, which is very relevant with the increasing number of population in the capital city and the need to encourage population concentration. So in a nutshell, I try to capture the structural constraint, and I cannot agree more with the recommendations or opportunities defined regarding the strengthening the policy and the regulatory framework to address the structural constraints and weaknesses. And also on this, I'm happy to see that the conclusions and recommendations of the paper validates the policy directions and the actions of the government of Mongolia has been taking since 2012, as Roger pointed out, with the introduction of the Local Development Fund, with the revised general budget law. We know that since 2016, with the adoption of the state policy on decentralization, government committed to address reform in a comprehensive way, which means it includes all sectors and considers the allocation of both functions and finances. Which means it also encompasses the fiscal decentralization aspect in the policy paper. And following the adoption of the state policy paper on decentralization, functional allocation methodology was approved in 2016. which means that, of course, following the adoption during the recent years, Cabinet Secretariat was leading a comprehensive financial analysis in all government sectors and subnational governments, applying the very sophisticated financial allocation methodology. And as I can see, the results of this analysis are now building into the proposals for reallocation of functions and to further be reflected in legal and regulatory framework of the local governance. I'm trying to use the time sequences, so and also to try to respond to the picture we've seen or description of the structural constraints. The government is being persistent. It's policies and policy positioning on the decentralization reform. So following the policy on decentralization and its functional allocation methodology, as a result of long discussion, the Constitution was amended in 2019, which also resulted in a legal reform, which will result in a legal reform and cover over 100 laws and contribute to a more stable policy, support decentralization and empower local authorities, such as increasing taxation power and accountability. We also can see that in the long-term policy papers based on the Sustainable Development Goal 2013 and Vision 2050 paper, adopted by Parliament, the government also prioritizes the decentralization reform and trying to address all the structural changes. Of course, it cannot be done overnight or with one magic bullet. But however, I'm very hopeful that with all these persistent policy and regulatory decisions, as Hans also mentioned with the revision of 2020 of the main local governance law, we have good solid grounds if also development partners would support the government in building the capacity, not only of those who are working at the subnational government level, but also those who are to build the capacity of the local officers and the parliamentarians. I would like also to take time to mention about the progressive decisions or the concepts introduced with the revised law or the law on administrative and territorial units. We can see that first time the government, the local authorities have the power to set local taxes and establish special purpose funds in addition to the local development funds. But all of this calls, of course, for more rigorous, strong accountability mechanisms. And what I was missing in the presentation of our presenters was the demand side of the governance. How are we, I think with all these incremental approaches and slow reform processes, what we can do meantime, waiting for the reform to bear all its fruits, is to complement it with empowered citizens' involvement in the decision-making, participation, as well as to ensure that there is social accountability mainstreamed in all aspects. SDC has been working with the multilateral, bilateral institutions to introduce social accountability at the local level so that we would showcase in a pocket of good practices the concrete improvement to the access of public services as well as the quality of public services in education and health sector. And we can see that for a country developing such as Mongolia, when the local authorities facing all these structural and capacity problems, they are happy to see the civil society helping them, and not rather seeing and criticizing, but rather putting their efforts to ensure that the basic public services are delivered to the local population and reduce the poverty. Regarding the strengthening accountability and monitoring of the performances of local authorities, Cabinet Secretariat introduced a citizen satisfaction survey, which is also, I think, complements official monitoring system where citizens are assessing the public service deliveries, and the results are now reflected in the action plans of local authorities to improve its performance and to be more responsive to the needs and interests of its citizens. So in a conclusion, I would like to say that there are structural, big, and very diverse constraints. The government is doing what it is they can do in their power. The legal reform is ongoing. The main foundations are built by direct democracy instruments such as agenda-setting initiatives introduced in the revised LATO. Now, it's important to ensure that there is coupled capacity building processes to address, as the presenters were rightly pointing out, serious capacity constraints. The people at the local level, they're doing their best with the limited resources, but at the same time, they of course like the guidances, and operationalization of the new laws and regulations are important. So I would call the ADB, since the Asian Development Bank is the host of this webinar, to also address this decentralization reform implementation support in its new country strategy, expanding its focus. I know we all need to do the prioritization, but as you all can see, the government has been persistent and committed to pursue the decentralization reform. As recommended, they're not rushing and they're doing step by step, and the capacity building and empowering citizens is other things which needs to be coupled. And with that, I would like to end my input, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think what you have mentioned really has reinforced what the presenters have said, but at the same time really have updated us on the latest programs in the country, such as introducing the citizens survey and the revised LATUC law. So there are incremental changes, so we need to keep in mind. And then you have also asked the very pertinent question on what we can do. It's not just the responsibility of the government. How can we assist the government in refining decentralization and improving public service delivery? So now turn to our second panelist, and Lakshmi. Lakshmi is the director for Economic Policy and Competitiveness Research Center based in UB, Mongolia. Lakshmi has over 10 years of experience in various public sector and private sector agencies. So over to you, Lakshmi.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Lakshmi. So I'm working as a director of Economic Policy and Competitiveness Research Center. It's a think tank here in Mongolia. And thank you for inviting me as a panelist on such important topic. So since 2012, the EPCRC, that's a short version of our center, how we're calling it, we are annually producing the provincial competitiveness report. It's an index where we are benchmarking the 21 provinces with each other. So the methodology of the report is using of primary and secondary data. That means on the one side, we are using the statistical information, and on the other side, we are surveying also each year businesses in the provinces. So in total, about 1,000 each year. So the main issue is again also, I think I want to be also a little bit controversial, because every time when we are talking about the local or provincial development, of course, the main topic is that the local governments need more power. That's every time the main issue. Of course, the decentralization issues are important. Or it's also important to delegate some of the issues to the local governments, but with the amendments of the changes of the LATUK, I think, like Zolzaya also pointed out, generally we need also to amend about 300 laws and regulations, and it will take time. And in my point of view, we cannot wait until there is a perfect situation where the local governments can act. So the environment where we are active is very dynamic and changes very fast. So on the other side, we cannot regulate also everything. Therefore, I was also thinking maybe to share some ideas how we can improve also, what we can do in the meantime when those kind of all those laws and regulations are amending. So for example, the local governments can attract investments, support local businesses by minimizing the bureaucracy of their administration. Of course, every year in our survey, we are asking the businesses what are the about 5 challenges they are facing. To highlight, it's an open up questions, and over the years, we see also over 9 years, the same problems are arising, like eliminate bureaucracy, corruption, it's the main issues, and also create favorable environment for businesses, and improve the transparency and quality of tendering processes, or improve the public procurement. So I think this also shows that the businesses need more a favorable environment, and that the bureaucracy of the local administration has to be minimized. Interestingly, for example, in 2019, I was participating in a workshop of the REACH project of USAID, and which they have been implementing in 4 provinces and UB. So the 4 provinces where they have been implementing their project was Abayamutli, Siling, Tornat, and Dondro. So I was asked, I've asked the question how they have been choosing those provinces for their projects. And surprisingly, they told me that in 2016, at the end of 2016, the governor of Dondro came to the office with our report, where in 2016, Dondro was ranked actually 21st. So they were asking for support in the development of their province. So this was also the reason why the REACH project has chosen the Dondro province as one of their implementing provinces. And so the main aim of the REACH project was supporting the SME development by improving their access to credit, financial literacy, and dissemination of information. So support for the small and development enterprises. And the governor this time also visited the Asia Foundation, and the Asia Foundation has supported, for example, also them, and established, for example, a woman business incubation center there. So because I was only in 2019, I've heard about it. I was looking also interesting about their ranking, to look into their ranking, how is it improving or not. So in 2016, they were 21st. So in 2019, they were ranked 18th. And in 2020, just recently, they have been ranked 16. So I think even there is not such a big development, but on the other side, there is some development in this regard. And so on the other side, I think the most important issue when we are talking about the local development is also to look into this issue on a bigger picture and in a comprehensive way. Because just recently we have been also within a project of EBRD on women entrepreneurship. We have surveyed businesses, and also on the provincial level, we have been also asking questions. What was have they been moved to open a new business from the province to the urban area or to Ulaanbaatar? If yes, what were the reasons? And the main reason for the people also to migrate to urban areas or settlements were also that they are looking for better educational system for their children. And additionally, the second reason for the movement was also that participants, that the market on the provincial level is of course underdeveloped and small. And so they are not able to recognize the full potential of their business, and also the poor business enabling environment and almost non-existent business development policies of local governments. About 3 years ago, we had been also looking into the local development policies of for provinces on request of GIZ. Are there such business support policies included in the local development policies? And surprisingly, we have seen also that there are no any business support policies included in the local governments. And I would also fully agree with Hans and Roger that on the financial side, that at this time we have been also asked about the monitoring reports, about the reports of and auditing reports of the some development funds and local development funds. And surprisingly, the information was also very, very fragmented and uneven. Some of the provinces were just sharing with us just open files, Excel sheets with the number with the name of the companies, and some of them were monitoring reports, and the other provinces told us that they don't have the power to monitor or look into the local development on the spending. So therefore, I think the most important thing is that in the meantime, when the government or the parliament is reviewing all these laws and policies, we need also, there is some light, and I think it will also dependent on the active operation of the local governments. I think that was all. Thank you. If you have questions, I'm free or open to ask. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lakshmi. I think as you mentioned, it's not just about the improvement of legal and regulatory frameworks. There are many things we can do, such as improving business operating environments, improving the disclosure capacity and financial management at the local government level. So now we have moved to the next stage, which is about questions and answers. I haven't seen any questions in the chat box, but I understand my colleague Pavit has some questions. Pavit, over to you.
Thanks so much, Emma. And pleasure to see you, Lakshmi, and Zolzaya as always, and very perceptive comments. And I enjoyed the presentation as well, Roger and Hans. I think that was a very comprehensive, well put together presentation. I think just one point, I wanted to tie in what Zolzaya mentioned about social accountability and the point that I think Lakshmi was making in terms of just the local business planning, architecture, and business ecosystem and the challenges around that. There's a big push now with the current government around e-governance and e-government. And this is really designed on the one hand to improve efficiency, transparency, but hopefully this will also help with resource allocation and more prudent fiscal management as well. So I just wonder whether this is a way to at least circumvent or get around some of these challenges, particularly in the GARE areas. the point that you touched upon, Roger, right at the end of your presentation. We've been working on some of these issues, ADB, and I think to go back to what Bruno said, this is still very much a work in progress. But bringing citizen services more efficiently to the end user and streamlining some of these systems, but also then using that to improve transparency, accountability, and Mongolia, on top of all of this, there's a very active, very active social media side in terms of the population. So that's something that can also be leveraged. So just wonder if either of the panelists or the Hans or Roger have any quick thoughts on that. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Emma.
Thank you very much, Pavit. That's an excellent question and extremely relevant for Mongolia. I wonder whether Hans, Roger, Lakshmi, Zolzaya would pick up this question. Maybe Roger, over to you first. Roger, are you? Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Emma, and thanks, Pavit. Gosh, e-governance. I mean, I guess maybe we can distinguish the two types of government service where e-governance could play a role. Firstly, for the various administrative services, the civil registry services, the issuance of birth certificates, marriage certificates, residencies, all of that paperwork, which citizens and businesses is so important in their daily life. Actually, Mongolia is already doing pretty well on that front with their one-stop shop setup, which is actually, I mean, I visited the one in UB and it is absolutely astoundingly impressive. And I know lots of IMAGs, a number of SUMs are also investing in setting up those portals, e-portals locally where citizens and businesses can access much more easily this. On the other hand, that's on the administrative service front. In terms of education, for example, or health, I guess in principle, there is scope for support to online learning facilities for kids in the GER areas, or more easy access to health services online. I just don't know enough about that particular technical area to say or to know what government might be doing on that front. I'm sorry, maybe Hans knows something, or other participants can chip in that. Over.
Thank you, Roger. Maybe I saw that the hands of our two panelists are all raised. So first, perhaps over to you, Lakshmi.
I think the okay. Okay. I think the e-governance issue is, of course, important, but during COVID, it showed also that, for example, access to internet is also very, very limited, because many reports showed also that in the GER district areas and also in the rural areas, majority of the kids were not able to join the online classes, and of course, also TVET schools were unable to, or the children in the GER district areas and rural areas were not able, because not every household has access to internet, first of all, and also the issue of this smartphones, tablets, and such kind of course, of the devices which they are using is limited. Therefore, I think that it will be a little bit limited, but of course it's an important issue and also an opportunity which has to be developed and further elaborated.
Thank you, Lakshmi. So services require infrastructure support as the foundation. So very important point. Zolzaya, over to you. Very quickly, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Especially during the COVID, as we can see, the e-governance is important, and with the seeing the initiatives of the government as well, especially to bring the administrative services closer to citizens, I think for that the e-governance is offering opportunities. We know that the business re-engineering processes are being carried out by the municipality of Ulaanbaatar city, and they are cooperating with the vertical agencies, the National Registration or Archiving, all the relevant agencies, to ensure that there is a shared databases in order to ensure that the services are now closer to the citizens and offered at the household level. Prominent examples of the successful devolution or the service delivery at Horo, which is the closest level administrative point for the citizens, is the registration and ID issuances. Now people don't need to go to the district centers, which are only 9 in Ulaanbaatar city for the population of 1.5 million. So from me, I see that, of course, a lot needs to be done, but there are concrete progresses. Especially also in addition to the administrative service bringing to citizens, we can see that the e-voting on the LDF prioritization successfully tested and ran for the 3rd year with the support of Asia Foundation and STC, and we can see the number of votes increasing, which is the prioritization participatory on the local investment funds. So I think this is the way to go, and we cannot just say that there are limitations and avoid it, but I'm happy to see that ADP is very interested and would work on it. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I saw that we have a question from Anand, who wanted to know a little bit more about managing urban development aspect and also short and long-term measures. The second question is very broad, probably we don't have time, but managing urban development part and its related index, could Roger, can you quickly, maybe in 1 minute, provide some explanation? Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Anna, for the question. Yes, I'm sorry I had to rush through that particular slide. I mean, the slide that you're referring to showed a graph of population movements out of the countryside and into UB and into the secondary centers, and the decline in population in the rural areas over several decades. That's a UN Habitat, from a UN Habitat publication a couple of years ago. That's what that slide was about. And it showed, it illustrated the need for both UB and the secondary centers to be gearing up, to be preparing themselves to respond to these massive challenges which already are faced and will be being faced much more in the years ahead as people move into the GER areas and start making demands on urban services. That was really what that was about. And so I guess we were also saying that therefore some of the constraints that the local authorities face in urban areas, there needs to be perhaps more thinking about that.
Very much, Roger. I think that's a very good place to move to the next stage, which is about closing remarks. I know we can spend much more time on this topic, which is extremely rich. So for the closing remarks, we have the pleasure to have our colleague, Pavit Ramachandra, who is also the country director for Mongolia Resident Mission of ADB. Pavit, over to you.
Thank you, Emma. Good afternoon, everyone, again. This has been, I think, a fascinating session. And as Emma said, the time is never quite enough for a topic as rich and important as this, and particularly very relevant at this time, I think, even more so in a COVID-constrained environment. Let me first start by saying that I've really enjoyed the discussion, and want to thank Lakshmi and Zolzaya for their excellent contributions. Emma, for your, I think, chairing this very adeptly as always. Bruno for his very insightful opening remarks, and Roger and Hans, as I noted earlier, for a very comprehensive presentation, and the original paper, which I very much enjoyed reading, and would encourage everyone in the audience, if you haven't read it, to get a hold of a copy as soon as possible. On the reflections from the session itself, I'd like to note that first and foremost that today's presentation by Hans and Roger touched upon a range of issues. These are either directly or indirectly quite relevant to the context of Mongolia's wider development agenda, as well as ADB's support under our current country partnership strategy, but also what we have planned for 2021 to 2024 in our upcoming country partnership strategy. So let me very briefly try to position some of these messages in the context of today's discussion. So over the longer term, the challenge really for Mongolia is to deliver a more resilient and broad-based economy. And I think our panelists alluded to this in their comments, capable of delivering inclusive and sustainable growth. To achieve this, Mongolia must broaden the economic base to more job-intensive sectors, strengthen education, health, and social protection to reduce socioeconomic and regional disparities and inequalities across the country. We know, and this is a well-known narrative here in Mongolia, the dependence on minerals, mining accounts for almost 93% of exports. And this is the fundamental reason really behind the country's economic and fiscal volatility, as it exposes the country to inherent commodity price fluctuations. This volatility and the limited job creation from mining, we know that mining is a capital intensive sector and only creates about 4.6% of jobs here in Mongolia, has really made economic diversification a key priority for successive governments and development partners like ourselves. Sustainability of progress in the public financial management space, given this resource dependence, has been a challenge. Again, something that was covered in the discussion today. Given Mongolia's high resource dependence, this is particularly challenging. Improving public investment efficiency, this has also been something that has traditionally been not a strong point and is a key priority for the current government, particularly given the constraints around the COVID environment. I think the presentation also very nicely touched upon some of the revenue challenges, particularly given the volatility associated with the dependence on mining revenues. So that's the other the flip side of this narrative here. We also know that Mongolia has excellent potential to boost exports in agriculture, tourism, services, and renewable energy. Given the potential that all of these sectors have to create jobs in the short term and support diversification, there really is an imperative to enhance the investments and create a better investment climate for foreign direct investment, and in turn enabling environment in the local governance space, a point that was touched upon, so that there can be really broad-based diversification. But diversification also means geographical diversification or spatial diversification, and not just in terms of the type of economic activity. It means moving away from the current concentration around UB and the mining areas and really looking at rural development and regional development. The development of rural areas has historically been constrained by low investment, weak infrastructure, a lack of jobs, and a deficiency of public services. Improving agriculture and livestock production and value addition will require strengthening environmental and natural capital management, targeted climate resilience measures, competitive industrial development, and stronger value chain promotion by increasing productivity, standards, and public-private collaboration. As highlighted by Roger and Hans, it is in this process that local governments could and perhaps should play a more prominent and decisive role in promoting and enabling local economic development, even more than is currently being done. But as also highlighted in today's presentation, although the current system of decentralized governance is still a work in progress, a point that Bruno made, and is still quite top-down, there are numerous opportunities in the current legal and legislative framework to make substantial progress. We have seen a series of initiatives towards decentralization, including the articulation of the Local Development Fund, which offer a promising trajectory for increased public participation and transparency at the local level. Strengthening local governance and local service delivery is a key focus for us here in ADB in Mongolia. In addition to strengthening public sector management, which continues to be a central theme for us, we have targeted interventions in the upcoming country partnership strategy aimed at delivering productive infrastructure, basic services, and addressing institutional deficits at the subnational level, including through a 10-year program to be delivered through a multi-tranche financing mechanism, which will focus on the Western IMAX or provinces, an area which I also know SDC has covered extensively. So we're keen to work and build on all the work that SDC colleagues have done. Finally, just let me say that it's important to note that the working paper was prepared before the COVID-19 pandemic came upon us. In their presentation, both the co-authors have tried to assess the consequences of the pandemic and the current recovery process for the main findings and recommendations laid out in the paper. As such, I think that the presentation provides a useful update on the original working paper without actually fundamentally changing any of the original findings. Let me again thank Lakshmi, Zolzaya, Bruno, Emma, Roger, and Hans for their inputs into today's event, and also thank, of course, all of you who participated. We hope to see you again at the next event in this exciting series. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pavet. I think for the various thoughtful points. Our two panelists both asked about what ADB can do in supporting decentralization and service delivery, and you have really shed light on answering these questions. I join you in thanking all the speakers and participants in coming to today's event. I also thank colleagues who worked hard behind the scenes to make this happen. Tony, Zoe, Stella, EJ, Pauline, and many other colleagues. Of course, we wouldn't have this event without the great partnership from our colleagues in SDCC. So thank you very much and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.